Ironically, the final nail in the coffin was me starting a startup to solve the problem of podcasting taking too much time.
Dear listeners, we are gathered here today to reflect on a podcast that is no longer with us, Voice Tech. The podcast was described as a series of conversations with voice technology experts. Haunting us today is the show's creator, Carl Robinson. Launched in April 2018, 86 episodes were published in total before the show was left to perish after just 2 years. On this episode, we'll learn what caused voice tech to be yet another headstone in the podcast graveyard. We'll celebrate the highs, lament the lows, and discuss whether it should be laid to rest forever or be brought back to life. From One Fine Play, this is Podcast Graveyard. Hi Carl, thanks for haunting the show today.
James, absolute pleasure.
So tell me, why did you want to make this show?
So I originally started the Voice Tech podcast really out of personal interest. I was doing a data science master's, working in the lab on machine learning models with voice data. I was working on voice emotion transformation, so actually changing a happy voice into an angry voice or vice versa. Didn't work that well, but I wrote a nice paper and got me my master's degree. But at the same time, as you can imagine, working in the lab's pretty lonely kind of task, especially as an intern. No one talks to you. So I started the podcast as an excuse to talk to the smart people around me and learn more about the industry. It was at the time when Amazon Alexa and all these voice technologies were really kind of, on the up as well. So it looked like a really good place to sort of direct my career. I started Voice Tech with those kind of aims in mind to help my career and to meet the people around me.
What gave you the inspiration to start a podcast? How did you come up with the idea of sharing your story in that medium?
Well, I'm a podcast listener, so I've always listened to podcasts and taking notes. I'm a rabid note taker, so I'd always listen to podcasts, pause it, write down what I learned, carry on. It matched what I was doing, I was working in voice and audio. So if I'm going to create content, I think it should be audio, and I liked it, so I just wanted to do it. Probably the main reasons.
What other shows were your inspiration when coming up with this podcast?
Yeah, so shows that I was listening to at the time, I was listening to Sam Harris and some of these kind of long form discussion podcasts, but also there was the VoiceBot podcast, voicebot.ai, which is still going. It's the leading voice technology podcast in the space. So I really like what Brett Kinsella was doing on that show. He was focusing more on the industry side, I would say. What's going on in the voice technology industry, the acquisitions and things like that, interviewing the leaders. And because I was doing AI, I wanted to focus more on the tech. So I thought I would differentiate myself by focusing more on the technology itself and interviewing designers, developers. How did you build it? And what was the traction and all this kind of stuff. So then I launched a newsletter to accompany the podcast, which I think is a great thing. I personally think anyone with a podcast should have a newsletter. And I got inspiration from James Cridland. And when I saw, his big list of sponsors on his pod newsletter, I thought I can do that for the voice industry. If I just get 20 sponsors paying me X amount a month, then that's it, passive income, which I did do. I didn't quite make enough to retire on the Costa del Sol, but I did get a few sponsors for my podcast, and that was good inspiration as well. When
starting out, what were your expectations? What did you hope to achieve?
I think that's something I did right, because I didn't have very high expectations. I did it really just out of curiosity. It was more of just a passion project at first. Like I say, I thought hopefully there'll be some side benefits of people, getting to know me. I'd have something that I could show people in interviews, but I didn't ever expect to make money out of it, monetize it, become famous, anything that, a lot of podcasters probably think that's going to happen after they record 3 episodes. I didn't have particularly high expectations, which is why I was pleasantly surprised when it did take off. And I had a lot of, very interesting companies wanting to be on the show. And I was like, really? What, little old me? Okay. Once you get a few, then it's easy to get a few more, and it snowballs.
So I'd love to take the opportunity to reflect a little bit on the journey of your podcast. Let's kick off with a little bit about what went into the show. So how much time do you think you were putting into this thing. You made 86 episodes, so cumulatively quite a bit, but, what kind of commitment were you making on that front?
Yeah, I dread to think about the total number of hours I spent on it. Time is definitely the biggest issue when making a podcast. It is a very time-consuming process. A lot of steps, a lot of tools, and it does add up. And even when you know what you're doing, there's no scalability, right? Like there is a certain linear aspect to this activity where you just have to go through every one of these steps every single time. I measured my time, I tracked it, and I would break it down by different activities to see which ones were worth outsourcing or optimizing. I had a checklist of things that I would do every time, so it's very important to be able to do that. And I in the end, when I really knew what I was doing, it added up to about 10 hours of work per episode. So I'll do typically 5 hours on a Saturday, 5 hours on a Sunday, but that's like almost a full day's work, both days of your weekend, and it was completely eating up my weekend. I was like, to do a weekly episode, you're dedicating your life to it. Yeah, it's a lot.
That's the thing that catches everyone out, isn't it? They think, this will be easy. We'll just turn up and what I like to patronizingly call play with the microphones, and we're done. And then as soon as you go down the rabbit hole, you realize you need to, I'll just do that extra little thing, and then I'll just do that extra little thing.
Totally. Yeah, and it all adds up. Even those extra little things are exactly what adds up. It's all about setting up a process with as few extra little things as possible. Even like creating a custom image for every episode. It's a nice to have, right? And you would want that, but that's like another 15, 20 minutes. Just to find the photo and format it and export into the right formats and then put it on social and all of that kind of stuff. And even though there are tools that supposedly do this stuff automatically, they never work 100%.
Sometimes people in our team will spend an hour thinking about the name of the podcast, what they're going to title it. That is, after all, probably the only thing that the potential listener is seeing in order to make the decision as to whether they press play or not. But you start wondering, like, the value of all this stuff. And on that note, how much money do you think you put into this podcast overall?
Well, when I was running it, doing it all myself, I would say probably like €100, dollars a month or less. I was paying for hosting, probably a few, 2 or 3 tools. Not a huge amount more than that. But then, as the work started building up, then you become, more ambitious. I set up a website and the newsletter, and I've got social media to take care of. And the time was just snowballing that I then started to consider outsourcing some of it, specifically the editing, first of all. Thought if I could get someone to edit this, there are companies like We Edit Podcasts and many more that would just do this stuff for you for around, I don't know what it was, like about $100 an episode or something. But then, of course, it requires you to monetize the podcast. It's like, well, I can't just be digging into my pocket $400, $500, $600 a month without actually trying to make some money from the podcast. So then it encourages you to start putting ads. One of the things that worked best for me was affiliate sales, which we can talk about. But at that point, probably at its height, when I was outsourcing as much as I possibly could and monetizing as much as I could, I was probably spending like 600, 700, maybe €800 a month on the podcast for one episode a week. Yeah.
Wow. So it really did scale up.
Yeah, absolutely.
Would you say it was a worthwhile investment?
Absolutely not so much from a pure profit point of view. Like I was always in the black. I never went into debt on my podcast. It always paid for itself, fortunately. And the affiliate sales were the thing that really helped me the most. These high ticket affiliate sales, as opposed to like ads or sponsorship on the newsletter. But it was never enough for me to just quit my job. I always thought it'd be great, do something like James Cridlin, have a load of sponsors, they'd be paying you. You could, rock up and do a couple of hours work in the morning, and then you'd have the rest of the day free to do your startup, dream or whatever it is. It never quite worked out.
I think what you just described is the standard podcaster's dream.
Yeah.
You took your standard newbie podcaster 2 weeks into their journey. That's what they would all describe. Yeah. It's easy. I'm just going to record on the mic for an hour or two, have a great chat, and that'll be my lifestyle sorted.
Yeah, for sure. It doesn't work out like that. There's a lot of stuff that either you need to do or pay someone to do. But in terms of was it worth it for all the other benefits that podcasting gave me? Absolutely. Like it transformed me in many ways. It made me a better speaker, much more confident to approach people. It expanded my network enormously, opened so many doors. It's now given me a great network in the voice technology industry and now in the podcasting industry, which is a new one for me. And led to me founding Rumble Studio, which is the thing that I'm working on right now. So all in all, invaluable, and I would recommend it to anyone.
What would you say the biggest obstacle you faced when trying to make your podcast was?
Well, it's the time, yeah, and balancing it with other things. Like you can find the time, but then do you want to spend that much time as opposed to doing the other stuff? Like if you're looking at it as a means to an end or a way to support your career or startup aspirations, you need to be able to have time to do these other things. You also want to have a life. You want to meet your partner, you want to get fit, you want to, and you just don't have time to do all this stuff. So there's always a trade-off. There's always that struggle. What do I sacrifice in order to make this work?
Is the ultimate conundrum, right? And I think you highlight there really clearly what lots of people also struggle with, which is, do I want to do this podcast thing, or do I want to get fit and go to the gym, or do I want to spend time with my family, or, and it's just that hierarchy of needs or wants, I suppose.
Totally.
That makes it super tricky. And I guess as well with the podcast, it's a brand build, right? So that you don't often see an instant return. You often see instant enjoyment, but not that instant return, because it might take 3, 4, 5, 10, 15 years to pay off.
That's a great point. Yeah, it's a slow burn thing. It's a long-term commitment. You don't see the results straight away. And the enjoyment will trail off soon before the results start coming in, I would say.
Do you have any super embarrassing or cringeworthy stories from your podcast recording?
When I listen back to the earlier episodes, they're a bit cringeworthy because they're very different from the later episodes. And, no one likes to hear their voice on audio recordings, right. Especially when you're starting out. But I made a lot of mistakes right at the beginning, like everyone does. And I know for my very first one, I did it with a friend. So I wasn't stressed about who I was talking to, but I was stressed about what the audience would think of me, about getting the questions right. I had everything scripted in this incredibly detailed script. I was sitting really poorly on my chair. I'd had my knees tucked up to my chest, hunched over my notes. And so my voice is really weak. And when I listen back to it, I'm like, oh my God, I sound really nervous, really small voice. This is, it sounds just so different from the later episodes that in a way it's embarrassing, but you're not going to take it down. That's where it came from. I think it's important for people to see the journey. It's slightly annoying that your worst episodes are typically your first ones, which is the ones that most people start with. If they listen to a podcast, they'll go to episode number 1 and listen to it. And you're like, oh, that's actually not the best, but hey.
I think it's the same on all creative journeys, though. It's exactly the same on YouTube. I was just cleaning up my YouTube channel the other day and I was like, oh my God, I need to hide these videos, unpublish these. That is shocking. But I think it's part of, it's a rite of passage, isn't it? That whole getting started thing.
That's it. Yeah, you should own it, feel proud that you went through it.
What do you think the worst piece of podcasting advice you ever got was?
I was thinking, actually, I think it's just get started, which is simultaneously the worst and the best, because to do a podcast, you do need to just get started, but don't just start recording your episode number 1 and then release it. I think that's a terrible idea, but you only really learn that in hindsight. Now, my advice to everyone is, first of all, make a plan as to why you want to do it, who's it for, what, how you're going to make money out of it, or how you're going to achieve the goals if it's not money. All these things. Have a really clear idea of what you're going to do and why. Then record a batch of episodes before you start releasing one. So you've got a few in reserve, because podcasting is all about consistency. Pick a cadence that isn't going to stress you out. So don't go for weekly at the beginning. I would say do one a month or one every couple of weeks at most until you really hit your stride. And then, record in a batch and then check in, see whether this is really the thing that, the thing for you before you then do the next batch, because it's not for everyone.
Yeah, and I think that piece of advice around just start is exactly what you say, best and worst. There's nothing worse than the procrastinator who just plans forever and doesn't ever get going, because there's so much you can't know until you've started. But also just starting isn't the best idea, because that's why I often think making a pilot episode is a good idea. So let's get into the nitty gritty. Why did your podcast die?
Ironically, the final nail in the coffin was me starting a startup to solve the problem of podcasting taking too much time. Because I could see the writing on the wall. Yeah, it was a little bit ironic. It wasn't lost on me at the time, but podcasting is time consuming enough, but launching a startup is the most time consuming thing you'll ever do in your life. And I got a new baby to boot. So all of that was just, I just didn't have enough time. My weekends were dedicated to other things.
And how did you know it was the end? Was there a moment when you were like, oh, okay, yeah, I have to accept this is it?
Well, actually, it's not the end. I'm still in denial. It's been over a year.
Great. Amazing.
No,
I love that.
It is dead, but I don't want to admit it. But it could come back. That's the thing. I live in hope. And sooner or later, you may see it rise from the ashes in a different format. So I'm definitely not going to go back to, carefully crafting one-on-one interviews with people and doing all the things I was doing before, 10 hours per episode. But if I can use Rumble Studio, for example, to record episodes in batches and scale it, then Voice Tech Podcast might come back in a different guise.
86 episodes is a lot to have recorded to just walk away from something. So I can see how you're still in denial.
Yeah.
And it feels like, you're really honest about the reason that you walked away was the time thing. And I guess I don't want to put words into your mouth, but even with revenue streams and money coming in, which is lots of people's problems that they can't afford to sustain their podcast because they don't have the money or the capital to invest in outsourcing. I guess you had some of that and it was still a drain on your time.
Yeah, because you still have to manage the outsourcers and they come and go, people leave and then you've got to train the next person up. So, I've worked with, outsourcers in the Philippines to do some of the more routine tasks. I've worked with companies to do the editing. It's just a lot of work. And if you can't even make a living out of it, then you can't do 2 full-time jobs at the same time. And even if you could, that wouldn't be the most efficient use of your resources. So.
What are some of the worst decisions you think you made when making your podcast?
One of them that I personally regret, the decisions I've made that have made me feel like dirty and disappointed in myself, was saying yes to guests who either I wasn't interested in at all, like their product is just so mundane, or I just don't care less about it. Whereas I really kind of prided myself of only talking to people that I could genuinely show an interest in their product. I could genuinely get excited about, because that comes through in the audio. Or people who I initially was interested in their product, thought this is cool, but then they came on and they were just like 100% sales pitch. They weren't interested in having a conversation. They had their lines pre-scripted and it was just totally one-sided. And I just felt exploited on my own show, which I really didn't appreciate either. So that's one of the mistakes that sticks in my mind.
So do you have any tips for how you screened guests? I think this is something that isn't talked about enough in the industry.
Well, yeah, actually. So I never really I did flirt with it a little bit, pre-screen calls, pre-calls. But I found that these pre-calls would, last like half an hour, which was like more time to the process. And then I was like, well, we could have used that as the podcast. So I tried to avoid pre-calls. I did have a guest application form. So I'd create a form on Google Forms and get them to fill it out. Because one, it tested their commitment, as in like, are you going to show up on the day? Because there's a lot of investment on my side to prepare for an interview. And some people just don't show up, which is incredibly disrespectful. It probably shows that they don't realize how much work goes into it, but it's just really, really annoying. But then it also gives them a chance to say what it is that they're interested in talking about, so that I can craft my questions so they can demonstrate their expertise. And I felt like that worked for me. It's not perfect. Having an audio version of a pre-screener would be great, because then you could actually hear what they're like on the mic. Sometimes you get people who wrote good suggestions but sounded terrible on the show.
Saying yes and no to the right guests was probably your worst decision. What were some of your best decisions that maybe you made too late? Yeah,
so we can talk about affiliate sales. I think that was one of the things that worked really well for me, in that originally, I was thinking in standard terms of I could do pre-rolled ads, host spoken ads. I can put logos on my newsletter, on the blog page that I create for every episode, this kind of stuff. So I would sell packages of that. And I initially set up Patreon with 3 different tiers, offering, different levels of host spoken ads and logos. That was my kind of offer for the industry, and had some takers on that, made some money, enough to cover the costs, which was great.
Are we in a position to talk about how much roughly? Like, we talking
from the logos and the Patreon? At its height, maybe $1,000 a month. Yeah, at its height.
Okay.
So it's not too bad. I was selling a package of $256 a month for a host spoken ad on 2 episodes a month. And that came with all the logo stuff, or it was like I don't know what it was, $50 a month, something like that for just the logos, which is nothing for a company. You look at what the typical newsletters charge is way more than that.
And how are you marketing that?
Well, I kind of marketed it. So I did a bit of research and outbound stuff. I was like, hey, I've got this thing, and I landed a couple of really interesting deals just by doing that. So it's amazing. You can pick up the phone and actually people say yes, but again, that's more work than what you're doing. So it was good, and then another problem with that, that avenue is that people quit, so that they're not going to stay forever. So you always have to be looking for new customers. So that becomes really becomes a business, and you have a pipeline. Do you really want a pipeline for something that's only less than $1,000 a month? it's just too time consuming. So.
But then it's also organic, which I guess is really interesting.
The organic ones are good. If people just go to Patreon, sign up, great. I launched a premium feed for the listeners as well. So for like $5 a month, you could get the ad-free version of the podcast and bonus content. But the problem with that is that creating bonus content is, again, more time, and not everyone gets to hear it. So you're creating this content for like 5% of your audience or something, which is a real shame. You know, like when you've got a guest on the show and they say something really cool, that guest wants that to be heard, right? Not just by 5% of your audience. So how much can you really gate? So the premium thing and Patreon, it was nice. It was nice to offer an ad-free feed, but yeah, adding extra content to it wasn't worth. In the end, I stopped doing that. I just said, it's just ad-free. And then they get access to the back catalogue. That's something that I found that the people are more willing to just pay just for access to the back catalogue of ad-free content, the new episodes. But then the thing that worked the best was affiliate sales. I had one or two partners, one of them selling courses, and these courses are quite expensive. You know, I don't know what they were, like $1,000 or $2,000 per course. And with the affiliate deal, I got 25%. So you only have to make one sale, and you got $250. Which is definitely worth it, right? For a small niche podcast that only has, my podcast downloads were my best episodes have got like, 1,700 listens, but on average it was maybe around 500 to 800 per episode, and they grow, the back catalog grows, but within the first 30 days, maybe it was like 500-600, which is not bad. It's better than a lot of podcasts, but it's not like, you're never going to make ad revenue off that. So affiliate sales is, I think, the best option for small download podcasts like that, because you only have to make 1 or 2 sales per show and it becomes significant. And
I just want to dive in with this because I completely agree with you, and thank you for bringing up the affiliate thing. And I'm also super impressed by what you did, and we should champion the fact that you had revenue coming in, right? You weren't going out pitching to Adobe or to British Airways to give you thousands of pounds. You were making plans and putting in products that allowed people to make essentially micro payments. So your listening audience, whether they were a brand who wanted to take advantage or whether it was a listener, they were able to make a small contribution to help you to grow the show and keep it going through affiliates. It has 2 really good benefits. That's one, is that you're making these micro revenues from your audience. But the second is that if you do run an affiliate program and you've got 1,700 listens and you convert 3 sales and you get your commission for that, you also now have data points of how many people you can actually convert for a different ticket priced product. So if you've got $1,000 ticket item and you know that your audience converts at 1%, you've got a data point from that, and no one took the risk to paying you for that ad. You might have a low ticket item that converts at 10%. And now you've got data points that you can take to a potential sponsor or advertiser who will then pay an upfront for that opportunity. But if you haven't got the data points for that upfront, why would they take the risk on you? So you've basically got a no stress, no commitment way of proving or trialing how an advert is going to work through affiliate marketing. Then once you've got it, you take that data and then you take it to a sponsor, and then you get them to pay for the upfront, because you've got some kind of reference point for them to work from. And that's how you unlock bigger deals, in my opinion.
That's a really great strategy, yeah. I wish I'd tried that sooner as well.
What aspect of your podcast do you wish you'd put more energy into?
I think maybe the planning right at the beginning. I didn't really plan it. And so now, as I was saying before, my advice is to plan. And I didn't plan it. I just thought that would be a cool thing to do and just started doing it. And one of the things that I could have planned better, perhaps, is the niche itself, because I feel like that the potential audience size is one of the biggest limiting factors of any kind of venture, really, whether it's a startup or a podcast. And voice technology, although it was really super cool, and having a podcast targeting a small, highly connected audience is a great way to grow quickly within that small audience. You quickly hit a limit. And that audience can only support so many podcasts, and there are already some people doing it, better and earlier than me. So there's, I realized after about a year or so, I can't grow it much bigger than this because there just aren't that many people to listen to it. And that limits the amount of ad revenue and affiliate sales and everything else you can get from it. So if I'd thought about it, or if I'd known then what I know now, I think I would have picked something that would easily evolve into something, a wider audience. like just go for more marketing in general, or the things that, that everybody wants, like wealth, power, status, all of these kinds of stuff. Even though that's not at all what the show that I wanted to build, it would have been like, successful in inverted commas more easily.
Well, I don't want to play devil's advocate, but I actually hear totally what you're saying. And with time, I think you can mushroom, but I would punt that your success, and I mean success in terms of download numbers and the relationships you built and the revenues you generated, are all down to the fact that you niched so hard.
Yeah, it's true.
Because as soon as you go generalist, it all goes wrong.
No, you're right. And I don't really know what the best route is to transform a niche show like that into something that could be more generalist.
You got to keep on keeping on. This whole show, did you mourn its passing, or were you relieved to see it go?
Like I say, I haven't completely let it go, so I still think it will rise again at some point. I haven't reached the mourning phase, but it does disappoint me, and it has been hanging over me for the last year. In that it's a fantastic resource, and to just let it fade away, it feels like a loss. So yeah, I do want to kind of make use of it, and I still on my LinkedIn profile, I still use it as credibility for what I'm doing now with Rumble Studio. It's part of my story.
How many people are listening to it now? I guess you still get a bit of outreach, and there must still be a community around it.
Oh yeah, it's weird. Yeah, I still get more than 100 listens a week.
So from everything you've learned, what is the one piece of advice that you would give to a podcaster just about to make that journey of making their first episode?
Well, I think the one piece of advice, I think I've already said it, which is to make a plan. So I really sit down and think about what it is you want to do and why you want to do it. But it kind of, contradicts the next bit of advice that I would give, which is what worked for me at least, which was don't start with any goal in mind. Don't have like high expectations, and do it for the love of it first, because I felt like that really worked for me. And they kind of contradict each other, because if you're doing it for the love of it, then your heart and soul will be in it. And I feel like that's a real important part of podcasting is, you're putting your personality into it, your own interest. But if you only do that, then it will burn out.
If your podcast had a headstone, what would you put on it?
This podcast died so that yours didn't have to. Head over to rumble.studio today and start creating podcasts asynchronously.
I love that. That is a cheeky plug, but I absolutely love it. I like the honesty that you have, that it was about time, and that whole irony of your podcast died because you were trying to build a thing that helped other people make more of theirs is great. And I guess I can relate to that because I've moved from production to education. It's a case of taking what I've learned and helping others to succeed and tell stories. So I appreciate that. And I think that would be a great thing to put on your headstone.
Thank you.
As we move to the closing act of this podcast, where we talk about whether this podcast should be resurrected. For me, I feel like, if I'm honest, with everything that I've heard you share, you had some real successes, and I'm so proud of you for some of the stuff that you did, the whole affiliate piece and the growth of the show from not really knowing anything about being a creator. You come from a developer background, not from a creative background. So I would say, in its purest sense, I get that developers are also creatives, and but you know what I mean? You don't come from being a videographer or a designer. I think you've done phenomenally. I think that the podcast served you, and it's opened up an incredible opportunity in what you're doing over at Rumble Studio. I am a big fan of, and I would love to see succeed, because I think it opens up all kinds of new opportunities for people to create and share and tell. I think what I would say is it should come back, but it should come back in an evolution whereby it's now putting you at the front. So it feels like your show is very much about the guests. It was very much about what can be learned in the industry. And I think that I'm a massive believer that the host is the most important part of the show. There's the only constant in your podcast. There are only two stakeholders, you and the listeners, and they're coming back and you're coming back, and the guests are changing. So it's about evolving the show into the Carl Robinson show. What are you learning, and what's your journey, and what's the journey that you've been on? And I think resurrection of the show is easy for you. It's about recapturing that audience by telling some maybe honest first person monologue type episodes that get it moving. And then it's all about an exploration of where Rumble Studio is going and the things that you're spending your time focused on as you've evolved in the voice space. So for me, I absolutely don't think it should stay dead. I think it should come back to life. And I think that it just needs to evolve and have you at its heart, really.
Oh, I appreciate that. Thanks very much, James. It definitely sounds good. And I would love to be able to use the tool that we're creating at Rumble to be able to resurrect my podcast, which is where it all started, and take some of your advice, actually, and share a few more of my own ideas.
Has this experience of revisiting the podcast lit a fire inside you again?
Yeah, I think it has. It's been therapeutic and motivating.
I love that. And that is what we're here to do. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. Just before we go, could you tell this beautiful listening audience where they can find more about you, what you're working on at the moment?
Absolutely, yeah. So to find out anything about company, you can go to rumble.studio, rumble.studio/newsletter, rumble.studio/podcast. We have some fantastic webinars and workshops there, which are free to download, that will tell you all about the asynchronous process. If you're interested in starting a podcast, there's some free templates that you can use. But talking about it specifically from an asynchronous point of view, like how you would plan those podcasts. And then we have a webinar to take you through the process from A to Z as well, produced by my colleague Letitia. So yeah, rumble.studio, that's the place.
Thank you. Really appreciate your time.